So we're going to go ahead and continue on looking at the U.S. entering into World War II. Again, this is the last picture of Norman Rockwell and his portrayal of the four freedoms. So remember, the four freedoms are the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, as well as freedom from fear, in which we can see that here. And as I mentioned kind of at the beginning of Wednesday's lecture, that when World War II is basically taking off, the U.S. declared themselves to be isolationists of, hey, we're not going to get involved in this war, we're going to go ahead and butt out. But we know that that's not really the case. The U.S. had instituted that cash and carry policy of, hey, you need stuff for the war, whether or not it's weapons, you need medical supplies, food, clothing, whatever it may be, come on over to the U.S., we'll give you that stuff in exchange for cash. Well, the U.S. is going to kind of continue on with this theme of, hey, we're isolationists, but again, not really. Because they do realize that it's very important that if they're going to get involved in World War II, or no matter what happens in World War II, that the British are going to come out on top and be victorious. So eventually the Lend-Lease Act is going to be passed, and the U.S. would be able to lend or lease arms to any country considered vital to the defense of the United States. In this case, that's going to be Great Britain. Obviously, France would be included in that as well, but by the time the Lend-Lease Act actually gets instituted, the French at that point had pretty much already fallen to German forces. But again, the U.S. is very slowly but surely, leaning towards going into World War II for reasons other than just an attack. And if the United States helped Britain, the idea was that they wouldn't have to go to war themselves, and they're going to give well over $40 billion worth of weapons to the British. The U.S. are also going to find a different way to help the British as well. Just like in World War I, the Germans were engaged in submarine warfare in which they were taking out British ships all the time. Again, the U.S. not officially involved in the war. They were like, hey, we can go ahead and sort of control the Western Hemisphere. We have this thing called the Monroe Doctrine, which back in 1823, James Monroe, who was the president of the United States at that time, said, any European country that comes into the Western Hemisphere, so pretty much from North and South America, so from Canada all the way down to Argentina, that's the United States' kind of territory to guard and protect and take over and whatnot. So all these European nations have to butt out. So even though the U.S. isn't officially involved in the World War II, they are going to have American ships start patrolling the Western Hemisphere area, really kind of just looking for the Germans and making sure they're keeping an eye on things. The Atlantic Charter is also going to be signed by FDR and Winston Churchill, who becomes a very famed Prime Minister of Great Britain, in which they decide that after World War II is officially over, whenever that might be, they are going to fight for democracy around the world. It's why the U.S. has become, I would say has that reputation of getting involved in other countries' problems. It's because of World War II and the fact that with the Munich conference, because nobody intervened, Hitler was allowed to rise to power essentially throughout Europe. And so the U.S. and British were like, we can't let this happen again. So if we start seeing problems arising elsewhere, we've got to kind of come in and put out the fire. So that's why the U.S. again has that reputation of sort of being a security player or a power player throughout the world, is really because of World War II. So in the Atlantic Charter that the British and the United States are going to sign, they're going to say, hey, we're going to fight for democracy around the world. They're also going to kind of give birth to the United Nations, which still exists today. The United Nations is a playoff of the League of Nations, which Woodrow Wilson had really advocated for at the end of World War I. And the idea was that countries would talk about their problems rather than going to war. The UN still exists today. Some people think it's great. Some people think it's a total waste of time. It's really kind of up to you and your opinion what you think. And then, of course, the United States is eventually going to help out the Soviet Union because in June of 1941, Hitler is going to break that Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. Reading your worksheets, most of you guys pick Hitler, and most of your reasons were he's evil, he wants power, of course he's going to break it. And he does. There were a few of you who had picked Stalin in the Soviet Union and had some really good reasons for it, but there's no doubt that Hitler's going to break that pact. Definitely one of the biggest mistakes in the war, because at this point he's going to open up a two-front war. Basically, Hitler got cocky, thought nobody can stop me, and decides to open up that war with the Soviet Union. That's going to force the Soviet Union to join the Allied powers. And it's really going to be kind of the beginning of the end for Hitler and the Germans. But really, we know that the real reason that the United States gets involved into World War II is because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So what exactly is going on with Japan, and how does Pearl Harbor even come to be? We have to look at sort of pre-war Japan. Before, like, I would say end of the 1800s, Japan was a very isolated country. It's an island, it's in the Pacific Ocean, and it had really been kind of just doing its own thing. When Commodore Matthew C. Perry, who was a naval captain for the U.S., visits the island, he comes over with like these four major ships. And when the Japanese see him, they're like, whoa, we're definitely behind the times. We've got to like ramp up, production. We got to make sure that we're on top of things. And at that point, the Japanese really start industrializing in the late 1800s. They do play a role in World War I, but they're really going to become synonymous with World War II. There are also some things you need to remember about Japan. They're in need of desperate resources, and they're a pretty, they're an island. So when you look at this here, you'll see that there's Japan, and completely surrounded by water. And something else to keep in mind about Japan is that they don't really have a whole lot of natural resources. So things like coal, iron, gas, oil, copper. The Japanese don't have access to that unless they import, which means they trade with other countries for those things. To import something means to bring in something from another country. Really the natural resources that the Japanese have are things like fish, they have trees and forests and things like that. But anything that you would need for industrialization purposes, Japan doesn't have because they're a pretty small island. But they are also very heavily populated. Today, 125 million people live in Japan. Tokyo, that's the capital city. It's also where the Olympics are going to be hosted this year. There's 12 million people that live in Tokyo. That's 3 million more than in New York City. So it's a pretty packed place. There's the growth of radical nationalism, especially in the military, that starts to grow in Japan. We'll kind of get to that in the next couple of slides. But Japan sort of realizes that, hey, we want to grow as a nation, and the only way that we are going to do that is by gaining land for markets for goods and services. And the Japanese also see themselves as the superior race in Asia. And if you kind of talk to anyone in Asian culture, they always kind of like pick on one another. It's like the Vietnamese do this or the Chinese do this. When I was in Japan, I went about 2.5 years ago. Yumi, our tour director, she was talking about like the Asians that you always see taking pictures. And she was like, yeah, those are the Chinese. It's not us. And she goes, and we don't like them either. And Japan, something to kind of keep in mind about them, they're a very homogeneous population. What I mean by that is that when you're in Japan, pretty much everyone that's Japanese is purely Japanese. Like if I were to go around and ask you guys like, oh, like what is your heritage? We're all pretty mixed. You might get someone who's like, oh, we're German, Swedish, and Irish. Somebody else might be like, oh, like I'm Chinese and Filipino. Like we all have like a mix of cultures. Not in Japan. They see themselves as like pretty much purely Japanese. And I would say like over 95% of the population is very homogeneous. And so because of that, they see themselves as the superior race throughout Asia. Another kind of example of like that Japanese other Asian culture rivalry. A friend of mine, years ago, they wanted to go to a sushi restaurant. And sushi, we know, is Japanese. And one of the girls was Japanese, and she was like, oh, like, what restaurant do you want to go to? And they mentioned this one sushi place, and she goes, that's ran by the Koreans, not the Japanese. We're not going there. Like, for her, it was a very big deal to go to a sushi restaurant that was owned by the Koreans, because they kind of have this idea that they are less than. So the rise of Imperial Japan. So, we've talked a lot about the Great Depression, that happens in the United States in the 1930s. But as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, there's also going to be a Great Depression that occurs throughout the world. And for most of these countries, it's going to occur in the 1920s. Well, Japan is frankly no different. Japan, again, relies a lot on trade. They have to trade with other countries in order to get things that they need, like oil, like steel, all those sorts of items. When the Great Depression happens, most countries aren't trading anymore because, frankly, they just can't afford to do so. Think about it. If you have extra money, you might be willing to buy a new outfit that you wouldn't normally buy, or you might be willing to, get some extra food at a restaurant. But if you don't have that money to spend, you're not buying other things. Countries basically operate in the same way. If the economy is doing well, they're willing to spend their money and spread it. If it's not doing well, they kind of just keep to themselves. And because of this Great Depression, Japan's also going to suffer because they can't trade with anybody else. And they're really starting to become like a military coup that's going to end up taking place, especially in Japan, because the military officers are going to blame all these politicians for the problems. Like, you're the reason that Japan is declining. You're the reason that we can't grow as a population, as a country. And by the 1930s, the military is pretty much going to be able to seize power in Japan. and they're going to essentially be a military government. Again, these military officers that are going to kind of end up seizing the government, they're going to very sort of quickly realize that the only way that they're going to be able to have sort of any power or strength throughout the world is by seizing territory. And so they decide they're going to go down south in Asia and start conquering different territories. The open door policy, which had been created during the late 1800s, which allowed countries, like the United States, Russia, Britain, France, Germany, to kind of take a piece of China. Japan's like, hey, everyone else is doing it. Everyone else is conquering territories for their own needs. Why not us? We should start doing the exact same thing. And really, at the time that this is happening, Japan had an emperor in charge, and the emperor is still there. And Emperor Hirohito, which you'll notice in the next couple of weeks as we get into it, is going to be used a lot for World War II propaganda as this evil thing. But Emperor Hirohito, by the time the military coup happened, didn't necessarily have a whole lot of power. Emperor Hirohito officially becomes the emperor in 1926. He remains in that position until he dies in 1989. So he's there for quite a long time. And Hirohito had learned something from his dad when he was a kid, and here's what he learned. If you want to maintain power, you don't get involved in politics, because all you do is piss people off. So you think about someone like Queen Elizabeth II. She has no real power, yet people love her. Why is that? Because her job is to show up to ceremonies and meet people and shake hands and talk to them and make them feel special. So nobody really feels the need to bag on the queen because she doesn't really get involved in anything political. And Emperor Hirohito sort of realizes this military coup is happening. If I don't go along with it or if I speak out, I'm probably not only going to be out of a job, I'm probably not going to be around very much longer. So he pretty much just lets this military coup happen and supports them as they start to go down south to conquer territories for resources. One of the first places that the Japanese are going to target is Manchuria. You'll notice it's to the left of Japan, right near Korea, and they're targeting that specifically for steel. You had politicians who were against it, but again, by the 1930s, the Japanese military had a pretty strong control in the government, and they would assassinate political officers who try to stop them from, taking over territories and establishing themselves as a real world power. And the military pretty much was now effectively in control, and they had established a puppet state in Manchuria in 1831. A puppet state is like they established their own government, although it's not necessarily recognized by other people. But what's really going to actually, let me go back. Sorry, I want to touch on this. I want you to take a look at this map here, especially where I have like my little mouse circling. If you notice here, the Philippines is in red, which means that the Japanese have taken over areas such as the Philippines. Keep in mind, this is the 1930s. At this point, the Philippines is controlled by the United States. The Philippines does not have independence. The U.S. acquired the Philippines in the Spanish-American War. So not only is Japan going south and conquering all these territories, they're even trying to take over areas that the United States has control of. So keep that in mind as I kind of go over the Rape of Nanking. So what's really going to kind of set the United States off becomes known as the Rape of Nanking. So China's capital at the time, Nanking, is going to fall to Japanese forces, and they basically ordered for the city to be destroyed. The Japanese are going to kill 300 of the 600,000 citizens in the span of 6 weeks. And the Japanese just came in and they slaughtered people. And something else to keep in mind with the Japanese, they take their military honors incredibly seriously. To serve in the military, it's very honorable, and they have a lot of pride. Especially if you look at like samurai warriors, one of the ways that you would like check your sword is you had to make sure it went through in a swift swoop and was able to cut off somebody's head in one swoop. It wasn't like, you were kind of like chopping away at it. If not, you brought like serious dishonor to your family, and you weren't considered like a very good soldier. And we'll see a little bit of that as we get kind of later into the semester and just looking at the Japanese and like their military commitments. But they, to not serve in the military or to not, try to protect your family and your country, it's seen as very dishonorable. But the Japanese, that were quite brutal. They're also going to rape at least 20,000 women and girls of all ages. And I'll come back to that last point, but I want to show you a couple of pictures from the Rape of Nanking. As you can see here, you have kind of like bodies and heads everywhere. You'll see this little baby in the corner here, just kind of left there, and all this destruction. Again, I kind of talked about like that samurai sword thing, like obviously this guy's getting his head cut off, and again, it has to be done in one swift swoop. If not, you bring dishonor to your family. And we'll deal with that other side another week. And this is big, and why is this big? The U.S. at this point is very upset. They've, the Japanese have got kind of taken over the Philippines, which we'll talk a little bit more about next week. The fact that they, went into Nanking and killed like half the population of Nanking and raped all these women. The U.S. gets extremely angry, and they decide we're going to put an embargo on trade with Japan. An embargo means to stop trade altogether. But also keep in mind, the Japanese, they rely on trade. They cannot survive as a country without trading with other countries because, again, they're a very small island with very little resources, natural resources. So if a country like the United States is going to cut off trade with Japan, it's going to hit Japan extremely hard. And on Monday, we're going to look at a little bit of an example of just how hard the Japanese were hit. But again, with the Japanese going through and taking over in Asia and that rape of Nanking incident, the U.S. just says, we're going to stop trading with the Japanese altogether.